Hello and welcome to Rage Quit. My name is Jay and today we are going to be looking at 5 mistakes from Games Workshop that actually turned out not to be mistakes. So these are generally going to be things that, riled up a large part of the community, maybe caused a bit of controversy at the time, but ultimately it turns out maybe Games Workshop were right all along. They're the kind of things that we're going to be looking at. If at the end of this video you like this video, do press like, it really does help. If you're interested in wargaming as a whole and you want to see more content like this, then subscribing is the best way. I could say press the little bell icon if you really want to, but that's completely up to you. So we're going to be looking at 5 issues. They're not necessarily in any particular order. I'm not saying one is worse than the other or was less of a mistake or more of a mistake. So let's crack on and we'll get on with, I'll say number 5, but as I said, no particular order. So the first one we're actually going to be looking at is possibly the most controversial one on this list, and that is price rises. So I'm saying GW raising their prices is not really a mistake. Now I appreciate that this might go down like a lead balloon, but hear me out. Games Workshop, like many other businesses, will raise their prices quite reasonably often, maybe like once every year, 18 months or once every 2 years, something like that. It's hard to really pin down. And it's no secret that pricing is a very sensitive issue because one, it affects people directly in their pockets, so it's obviously quite important. But then if we mention things like the pricing in New Zealand and Australia, the prices around the globe, it's inconsistent at best is possibly the nicest way I can say that. And some people would definitely argue that it is unfair, and I completely understand that, and I wouldn't argue against that without having a lot more information than what I currently do. But any Games Workshop price rise ultimately leads to many complaints online, and I've made videos of being like, oh, when will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, because they do seem to raise their prices possibly more than other companies, although that could just be a subjective opinion of mine. But this was actually one of the reasons I got out of the hobby the first time around. Essentially, I couldn't keep up with the prices, I couldn't afford it. There was other reasons, and we'll actually come on to one in a moment. However, it's very hard to argue that Games Workshop raising their prices is actually a mistake when we look at how well the financials for Games Workshop are doing. They are booming at the moment. Okay, boomer. But they are literally booming at the moment. Their profits are through the roof. The amount of money that they get to give to the stakeholders, shareholders, etc. are going through the roof. It's very hard to look at the success Games Workshop is having and then say that raising their prices was a mistake. You know what I mean? I think that it's reasonable to assume that if Games Workshop have raised their prices, that they did it in the knowledge that they could do that and still make money, right? And in the miniature wargaming hobby, generally it's seen as being price inelastic. What that essentially means is that they can raise their prices more than they will lose their sales, essentially. It's a bit more complicated than that. So they can raise their prices, not lose the sales, and just pocket the difference, the profit, basically. So it's very hard to say that Games Workshop have made any mistakes in the past by raising their prices when they continue to be the top of the pile, the dominating factor in the wargaming sphere. We'll move then on to number 4, which is the Games Workshop accessories line. Now, obviously, I appreciate that this might seem a little bit vague, but Games Workshop accessories are sort of much maligned online. Now, this ranging from the water pot, which is essentially just a mug, or the mold line receiver, which was essentially a piece of metal. The accessories that Games Workshop release don't generally get a great rep. However, the actual quality of the products, I've got to admit, are always quite high. Now, it's no secret that they being Games Workshop, have a reputation for pricing these higher than other suitable alternatives. Like, for example, the clippers. I'm not 100% sure of the cost, but for sure the cost of the clippers in comparison to one that you can maybe find in your hobby store is obviously much different, and they essentially serve the same purpose. Now, is this necessarily a problem? No, I don't necessarily think so, because the goal from Games Workshop here is that they will have everything that a new player needs. You can walk into a Games Workshop shop, funny to say that, you can walk into a Games Workshop shop and then buy everything that you need to get your models off the sprues, take off the mold lines, glue them together, spray paint them, and ultimately paint them. Now this includes stuff like the paint handles. They do very well. Initially people were skeptical at the paint handles, but I have one. A lot of people own them. I was going to see if I could try and grab mine, but it's out of reach. You know, a lot of people do have them, and people will even swear by the mold line remover. I eventually bought one to give it a bash. You know what? It's okay. The items, whilst expensive, are pretty damn good quality, and the fact that it now allows Games Workshop to have everything that a new player could want is pretty good. And again, going back to the profits and the price rises, they're not having any negative effect by having maybe their items being slightly above other people's items in other companies' items in terms of expense. So could you call that their accessories range a mistake, even though it's possibly seen by the community as overpriced? No, I don't think so. They have it with a very specific purpose of being able to have a one-stop store, and the profits are showing that this is pretty much a success. Now in number 3, this is one that I never thought was actually a mistake in the first place, but you know, I was actually struggling to find 5 proper mistakes that weren't mistakes, so bear with me on this one. And it is actually the Warhammer Adventures books. Now this did get a lot of controversy online, and I just never really saw the other side of this argument. I never really properly understood why people were annoyed with it, and I still sort of can't to this day, so just keep that in mind. But essentially these were a set of books aimed in the Warhammer universes, aimed at children. And now I can understand a little bit that some people might say we don't want the grim dark universe to be watered down and that it should keep true to its roots. But ultimately, really, I think that doesn't really hold water. These books have come out, and I'm not sure if they've sold well or they've not sold well, but they've definitely, you know, the earth is still spinning. The Games Workshop universes are still, you know, pumping out releases and doing well. A set of books that were essentially read, I think they were read by Billy Piper and David Tennant, that were aimed at getting new players into the game. Did it really do any harm? No, I don't think so. And the fact that they're now doing other media in terms of like animated TV shows, they're doing the comic books with Marvel, really, I think for those diehard fans who are very ardent in their passion and belief that the universe should be unsullied, again, no Game of Thrones reference there, then I think ultimately they're gonna just probably relax and it won't be a problem. So for number 2, we're back at probably one of the more controversial ones on this list, and we're going to be talking about Primaris Space Marines. So essentially for the 40k Army Space Marines, hey, that's the name of the army, I didn't make it. For that army, the normal size Space Marines have been replaced by Primaris Space Marines, which are essentially bigger Space Marines. Now, whilst there may have been issues with the slow replacement of normal Marines to Primaris Space Marines, you know, I think we're only recently getting like Mephiston as a Primarch or whatever it is. I don't really follow 40k too much. Whilst there may have been problems with the slow releases, etc., really have the idea of having bigger Space Marines that are maybe easier to assemble, easier to paint, look a little bit better proportioned in terms of scale, because scale was creeping up across the board for Space Marines, and even though they were getting a little bit bigger, it didn't really make any sense. There wasn't any consistency there. So instead of getting a scale creep, just coming out with a better proportioned Space Marine and calling them Primaris Space Marines seems to have satisfied quite a lot of people. Obviously, if you're going to revamp your entire most popular range of products, we believe Space Marines are the most popular item that Games Workshop sell, that could have very easily have backfired. Indeed, a lot of people were not happy, and understandably so, because if they're going to essentially, they're not getting rid of, they didn't squat Space Marines, but if you're essentially going to replace them, which I think most people can admit that Primaris Space Marines are, in the long run, probably going to be the only Space Marines. In 15 years time, I'll be surprised if the normal smaller Space Marines are still around. Whilst that could have very easily have backfired doing that, Games Workshop getting everybody to buy Space Marines again seems like to their opinion, a good business move, and it does allow you to have a smaller army, which means it's easy for people to get into, to have an elite army. So all in all, I think Games Workshop may have annoyed some people doing this, but it seems like it actually was the correct decisions. And again, the profits of Games Workshop seem to suggest that that is the case. And lastly, we are going to be looking at, for number one, this is one that is very dear to my own heart, and that is Warhammer Fantasy being squatted and essentially replaced by Age of Sigmar. Squatting is a whole thing on its own. Squats, I think, were like 40k dwarfs essentially, called squats, that got removed, hence the name squatting. It essentially means Warhammer Fantasy was removed, kaput, got rid of, and replaced by Age of Sigmar. Warhammer Fantasy Battles was actually the game that really started me in the hobby and the game that I was playing. So I'm sort of a little bit emotionally tied to this one, as long with I'm sure many of you. Now, I think it was in 2011 that the end time started coming for Warhammer Fantasy. This was like a series of books and campaigns that essentially led to the demise of that universe. Now, this was ultimately replaced by Warhammer Age of Sigmar. I think that happened in 2015. Essentially, it's sort of the same universe, but a catastrophic event happened, etc. And I think it was essentially rebooted. But this meant that the game went from square bases to round bases, and the whole lore was changed. Now, this upset many people, including myself. Like, at the time, I was convinced that this was a mistake. I thought Games Workshop were like ruining the hobby. I was done. Now, there's a couple of reasons that this might have happened, whether it be to the reasons to do with Games Workshop wanting a unique IP instead of having the generic fantasy IP. There's a couple of reasons. Maybe they wanted to get rid of square bases because a unit was 40 models instead of maybe 10 and it would look better on round bases. There's various reasons that might have happened, but ultimately, it now looks like Age of Sigmar sales are up. It's proving to possibly be more popular than Warhammer Fantasy Battles ever was. And now Games Workshop have that unique IP. You know, the Sigmarines and all that kind of stuff, the Stormcast, they're all essentially unique enough and named enough that they're more likely to be able to sell those rights. However, it does actually seem that, like with Total Warhammer, that the classic fantasy is actually still well liked and beloved by a large amount of people. But all in all, I do think that this change was possibly required to bring in the new era of Games Workshop. So people keep calling, they will refer to New Games Workshop, and this definitely seems to be an example of New Games Workshop. Now, whilst this decision was actually, I think, made by the previous CEO, it sort of seemed to lead into the new Games Workshop era. And it's very amusing now that, yes, Warhammer Fantasy seems to be coming back. Age of Sigmar, though, it still seems to be more popular. If you ever check like Google Trends, or you check it on YouTube and stuff like that, and you talk to podcasters, they seem to be saying that Age of Sigmar is more popular now than Warhammer Fantasy ever was. But whether or not that's a rise of Age of Sigmar versus Fantasy, or whether or not that's a rise of the internet in general, you know, it's actually reasonably hard to say. Now, the fact that Games Workshop is bringing back Warhammer the Old World really does just confuses things. However, that is 3 to 4 years away, and I do think that this is actually a way of Games Workshop essentially trying to have their cake and eat it as well. And they may get me back. I wasn't interested in Age of Sigmar, but they may get me back for the Old World. And I know I shouldn't do it, but I think I might. So that's it. There are 5 things, or 5 possible mistakes, that I think ultimately weren't mistakes. I think Games Workshop's success currently suggests that they definitely aren't mistakes, but I can understand each one mostly for why people would say that, and I don't mean to diminish them in any way. The fact that Games Workshop raises their prices, I understand, could be some serious issues for certain people who are on budgets, and I don't mean to diminish that in any way, and I wouldn't try and do so. And things like the primary Space Marines, if you already have Space Marines and again, you don't want to upgrade, you're going to be unhappy. I understand that. You know, the hobby accessories, I think they're okay because people can just buy the normal hobby accessories, so I don't think that's ever really an issue that's going to concern people. And Warhammer Fantasy getting squatted, as I said, that really hurt me at the time, so for sure I'm with you on that one. But it's hard to look at the success of Age of Sigmar and say, you know what, Games Workshop, maybe it wasn't a mistake, maybe you were right. It's, you know, it hurts my feelings to do that, but maybe that is the case. Let me know if there are any other mistakes that weren't mistakes by Games Workshop, or if you think these were pure actual mistakes and you think I'm an idiot for saying they're not. You know, let me know in the comments. Don't rage, just let me know in the comments. It'll be fine. Other than that, guys, do make sure you like this video if you like this video. Subscribe if you're interested in wargaming as a whole. Thank you so much for watching. Have a most beautiful day, and goodbye.